I'd now like to invite my co-moderator for this evening to join me on screen. She's a former producer for CBC Radio, an independent writer and researcher on multiculturalism, disability, and equity. Shefali Sojani, how are you? So glad you can be a part of this.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you very much. It's a wonderful evening, and I want to thank the Walrus for the opportunity to moderate this conversation, especially after hearing such thoughtful and engaging, indeed, I would say fierce talks from our speakers. Thank you again to Roberta, Allison, Sean, and Anne. And again, following Sean, my name is Shefali. I am a brown-skinned woman with short, mostly white hair. And I'm wearing a blue dress shirt sitting in my dining room. I'm also partially blind, and so Jennifer will be helping us by reading the questions as they show up in the Zoom chat box. I have many questions, and I'm sure that our audience members likely do as well. We're going to start the Q&A session. To submit a question, you can text it, you can ask it in the Zoom chat box. And I'd like to ask our speakers to join us on camera now as we wait for those questions to come in, and I'll try and get us started. Welcome back, everyone. Hi. So let me sort of summarize a little bit what a few points that I picked up from the presentation so far. I felt like one of a takeaway for me from everything that you folks said was that instead of thinking just about resilience, which is important to us as communities and individuals in how we survive in difficult circumstances, it's almost as if resistance is actually more important in this context. And so I'd like to maybe go around a little bit to ask you about some of the strategies of resistance and goals of resistance that are really important. And I'm thinking particularly, if I could start with Anne and Allison, maybe reflecting on yesterday's conversation where our Prime Minister finally made it to the Tk'emlúps community and apologized again, and was received very graciously by the elders in that community, but was told over and over again that what was needed was action, what was needed was a nation-to-nation relationship, and was reminded about the importance of land and sovereignty. So I wonder, Anne, if you could start with reflecting on that in terms of resistance and how resilience can be converted into resistance.
I think that there's something to be said about making sure that we're speaking about the present as well as the past. And I think this is something that has definitely come into play with the Prime Minister and the performances, to be honest, in a lot of times of grief and the way that gets addressed in the present time. As Allison mentioned, our communities are grieving. This is a difficult time, and part of that is because we're grieving the effects of this loss in the present, and we're grieving the fact that when these children were lost and when they were in these residential schools and when they were pulled from their families, that at that time it wasn't seen as grievable. And so I think that for me, transitioning to resistance is really about thinking carefully about what it is we're surviving. Why is there a requirement to be resilient? What's after us? And then we have to, sometimes fight back, quite literally, because these invasions are still happening. We're still finding our land taken from us or contaminated. Children are still being taken from their homes into the foster care system. These are attacks that are continuing, and so I think it's a convenient tactic to place this in the past and then call it a tragedy. But these are factors that are still happening and are still really affecting Indigenous lives in the present, and that's not only grievable in this moment, it's actionable. We can stop that from happening if we're doing that with the support of others as well. And I think that the flip side of that is to make sure that we're not attacking and criminalizing people who are doing those actions. That means the land defenders who are out there making sure that more land isn't taken or contaminated. We can't be putting those people in jail. We should be having an abolition mindset about this. So yeah, I think that you're absolutely right that the hinge to resistance is really necessary. And I think that's also about the way that we pull those issues that are getting cast as parts of the colonial past into the present.
Alison, could you comment on that too? Because one of the things I was struck in your presentation was the importance of singing and joy and keeping that present and active in the way that you do your resistance. And again, thinking about yesterday's presentations, I was really struck by the importance of ceremony in Indigenous community and Indigenous practice. Could you talk about how that fits into resistance?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, I come from family that resisted the potlatch ban for 75 years. The work of my great-great-grandfather, a lot of it was illegal to possess. And he still made masks for ceremony. And he is acknowledged to have been a force in preserving and continuing that culture. And I think part of our resistance is continuing to practice these things and continuing to live, and that these are not just traditions and they're not historical artifacts, they're ways of living and being and relating that are present now. And I think that it's also where apologies are extended, accepting, but also acknowledging that this isn't new information, that these things happened. And, there was an entire report about it years ago and nothing happened. So yes, be sad for what has happened. And yes, be sorry, but tell me why you didn't do anything about it. And I think that's really what needs to be said, is that we need to be able to have this dialogue, and we need to have those difficult conversations about how we move forward in the face of that lack of action and how action will look moving forward.
One of the things that you mentioned, Alison, which also resonated with me as a person with a disability, was this idea that these systemic oppressions and violence of colonialism was converted through the language of resilience into something about the personal failing of the person who was not resilient, right? And I think, Sean, perhaps you can jump in at this point, speaking from a disability perspective, the way that disability is always personalized on the individual, that resonates very strongly for me. And I wonder if you could comment on that, as well as the way you talked about the practice of access a little bit more.
Yeah, of course. I mean, growing up as a visibly disabled person, it was always, taught to me that disability was something located only in myself. And it wasn't until coming into disability culture that I began to understand the social ways that disability is created. And I look to leaders in the disability justice movement like Talila T.L. Lewis, who gives us a definition of ableism that I've always really turned to when I'm thinking about the ways that disability is a construction. And Talila, if I can recall, it says that ableism is a system that places value on each of our bodies and our minds around this idea of what is normal and what is valuable, intelligence, excellence, productivity. Those are the things that society values, and disability is the antithesis to that. And so ableism is a form of systemic oppression, and it's something that often doesn't get acknowledged through that lens of self-determination. And so you don't have to be disabled even to experience ableism. Ableism is a part of the structure that maintains, all the ways that we understand oppression. And so I think for me, when we're talking about this idea of resilience, I think what you said, we are actually talking about resistance. And disabled folks can teach us a lot about the way our society is constructed through disability culture, through imagining disability not as something to be eliminated or cured, but actually something with a place in our futures, something along that curve horizon that actually suggests disability is a difference that we can desire.
I'm going to jump in with an audience question. This is from Celeste. Really appreciated and resonated with what you shared, Dr. Timothy. What are the long-term changes and shifts in Canadian society you hope to see as a result of the new curriculum you're developing for the upcoming MPH in Black Health?
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, folks, for the conversation. I think that I just wanted to add that the notion that colonization is post is a problem. We are currently living and surviving in a colonized system, which violates Indigenous folks in Canada and globally. As an African Indigenous person, and my experiences, my name Timothy comes from a history of colonization, right? The fact that I speak English as my language and don't speak my Indigenous language comes from a history of colonization. So back to the question, which I think I'll relate to the MPH and Black Health. Number one, that there's always these pieces about curriculum, and when we ask about adding in curriculum on Black health particularly, and also Indigenous health, there's always a piece of how do we do it? We don't know how to do it. Well, in a Eurocentric white supremacist system, of course you don't know how to do it, because that would be a way that the system would be dismantling itself. So I'm very, very aware of the educational system and what it does, and the violence that I've experienced, and many of us, I'm sure, on this call and in this, who are going to be listening to this have experienced. The MPH in Black Health hopes to bring curriculum to talk about global Black Indigenous health. And what that means is that providing programs not only on the impact of anti-Black racism, but also on our African spiritualities and wellness systems of health that are not being represented in the Canadian colonial system. I come from 3 generations of African spiritual practitioners who were banned in colonized places and spaces based on bringing African traditional spirituality to our community. So doing challenging the health curriculum by actually including an anti-colonial Black feminist lens, intersectional lens to public health is what this program hopes to do. And it's doing so in a system that is colonized. So therefore there are limitations, but resistance, as we always have been taught, is something that we're going to continuously do to dismantle not only systems, but also dismantle ideologies and practices like in your brain consciousness, right? Decolonizing, dealing with internalized white supremacy or internalized anti-Black racism is really a critical piece to the healing and well-being of our communities. Thank you.
Can I ask you to comment a little bit more directly on your personal experience of this word resilience? I know we're talking about it today, but I'm wondering, anybody can jump in. Is there a moment when you sort of heard it and you went like, I'm gonna blow a marble, the top of my brain if I have to hear that word one more time? Anybody?
I guess I would say in the context of the pandemic, it has been really challenging. I mean, I speak from an Indigenous perspective, but also from a disability perspective. And my condition is exacerbated by stress, and these have not been calm times. And, having to focus on, the resilience to get through. And it's kind of like, I am tired of being resilient. I would like to be done and like skip to the end, because it's objectively too much some days, and it's not comforting to feel resilient. I just want to rest.
Right. Anybody else?
I think that the word does make me cringe and say some other words that I can't say on film. But yeah, resiliency is something that I think the weaponization I think that was used today in terms of the conversation. It's something that, also if we as folks who are surviving trauma and drama and colonized violence, when we say that, we have had enough, or that we're grieving, or we don't want to have to deal, then there's that kind of the old, racist stereotypes of who our communities are come up. We're not working hard enough. We complain a lot. We are the angry Black woman for myself and other folks, lazy, etc. So, resiliency to me is really it's not only just problematic, it's violent. And it needs to be not used in the work that we're doing, because I think it doesn't add to the revolutionary practices that we have, our ancestors, our children's have, and us, that we're engaging with. So I actually think it's an act of violence, the way it's used, particularly as it maintains a system or a state that continuously acts on colonial violence.
Sean, can you talk about how you react to that word and the ways in which some of the creative approaches of disability arts are deployed to kind of convert? Really, I think that what we're talking about here is to not be required to talk about resilience, but to actually talk about how tired we are of having to endure.
Yeah, thank you. And, the word resilient immediately also recalled the word inspirational to me as a disabled person, and the way inspiration porn is kind of employed in a similar way as absolving, systemic structures and barriers for disabled folks. And I think creative access and, disability culture more generally really works to question a world that makes inaccessibility possible. And I think too, one of the artists that we recently exhibited, Gloria Swain, who, as an aging mad Black woman, curated artists as part of the show around Black artists with hidden disabilities. And one of the artists wasn't able to be a part of our show. And rather than just kind of, replace the artist, Gloria held an empty wall with with a piece of text about how to hold space for not just this artist, but artists who can't fit into the arts system just because of the barriers, the speed, the pace, the need for output that is so prevalent in our art world. And I think, as Dr. Roberta Timothy, as Allison was saying, as Allison Tedford was saying, we need rest, and we need to question these systems that we are participating in.
Anne, did you want to comment on anything?
Just note that part of what is distressing about the language of resilience is that it continuously refers our value as Indigenous peoples back to the colonial system. And I think it's really important to find ways of valuing us and valuing our cultures that don't reference colonization, because we held value before conquest, and through. And so the fact that we've survived that, I think that was part of what I'm trying to get to in the talk, is that that ability to survive is not passive, and it's worth looking at the ways in which we're resisting. But I think it's worth going a step beyond even that, because even resistance talks about what we're up against. I think that we also need to be thinking about how we hold value without reference to these systems at all. And to do that with other communities that are also facing this form of marginalization, and to see that and recognize it in each other. That we can recognize each other and show solidarity and really show up for each other without having to turn to the system at all. And so I think there's a refusal there that I try to practice around where our value stems from as Indigenous people.
Can we talk about that a little bit then? If we're going to say that we want to try to imagine, to borrow Sean's word, if we want to try to imagine different ways of being, different ways of relating, what are some of the values or practices that we would like to see? Like Sean has mentioned, for example, this idea of leaving the blank wall and finding space for the person who can't be there. Are there some other things that you would like to see that could be, that you can imagine that could happen, outside of, or somehow, in a separate way without reference to these other structures?
that for me, Shefali?
Sure, anyone, jump in, and feel free to speak to each other as well.
I mean, I think that there's been a lot of kind of colonial tricks around how this system can recognize us and without changing anything. And I mean, the land acknowledgement, it has become one of those where institutions that are built on stolen land, sometimes having used enslaved labor to build up their very foundations, then make these acknowledgements of past harm. And so I think that we need to be moving past that to think about relationship. And so where the action stems from for me is thinking about how it can be in better relation with groups who, when I think about how my actions might be affecting someone else's existence and possible survival. And so I think it's about thinking really carefully about how I might be a good relative to these other groups that are experiencing oppression. And I think everyone should be asking that. And then beyond acknowledgement, it's also about the protocols for living on other people's territories. I ask people, instead of doing acknowledgements, to think about what gifts they've brought if they are coming to as guests to someone's territory. It's worth asking, have you been invited? And if you haven't, then where's that relationship gone? Have you worked to try and build a relationship that might in the future, bring about an invitation? So how can you make your presence less violent in these spaces? And I think it begins with having those conversations and building those relationships. And you can't do a land acknowledgement without actually being in conversation and relationship with the Indigenous peoples whose land that is. The words aren't enough.
Roberta, how would you like to imagine things operating differently?
I think, well, I like what Anne said. And I mean, I think solidarity movements among people of oppressed are critical, because the divide and conquer that happens as an act of colonial violence, when we think that our movements are our own and we stay in our little places and spaces, we see that we continue to live under colonial restraints. And there's a long history of Indigenous peoples globally really supporting each other, right? In terms of how I can tell you, in terms of African folks surviving enslavement that had to do with Indigenous peoples from the lands that when we were taken and brought, stolen away from the continent of Africa, particularly. So for me, solidarity is really important. I really challenge the notion of kind of this of allyship without action and solidarity, which leads to not only having, feelings for folks, but actually stepping up. Like, what are you doing? What are your actions? What are you giving back? What are you giving away? Because a part of reparations and, reconciliation is also about giving back what's not yours. So, I was having a conversation earlier with folks, and it's like, if we really want to make changes within a system that is colonial, then why are we not why is Indigenous curriculum not centered in all of our educational systems? Why are we not speaking Indigenous languages? Why are we not, having conversations in ways that actually will make change? So to me, that's a piece of what I would do. Also, I think that the African Indigenous ways of knowing and wellness are important to understand. They're important to share. We bring laughter, we bring enough jokes, we bring creativity and the arts, and we do things in a different way, like how we live. And I'm really thinking that we need to creatively look at outside of the boxes we've been put in to do this resistance-centered work.
Well, on that, I'll jump in with an audience comment and our final question here as we're coming to the end of our hour together. This is from Greg, who adds in chat, the depiction of non-white joy is missing from popular culture. And Greg references an episode of Small Axe that broke through this, showing Black celebration. And you just mentioned this, Roberta, about jokes, and Allison in your talk as well. For each of you, as well as you, Shefali, what's bringing you joy, especially in the pandemic? Where are you finding it? Sean, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I'm thinking there's so many things. But I think one thing that's really bringing me joy right now is seeing CRIP interdependence, leaning on one another. And coming together as a community digitally. I think that's something that we haven't been allowed to do as much. And the pandemic has sort of set a different term of working. And so I've been able to collaborate and meet with a host of other disabled folks, which has been really, really great, really joyous. And just being able to lean on one another for support in these times has been very powerful.
Allison?
I've really been enjoying time with my son, who's 13, and also getting to do more speaking because, I mean, as someone with a disability and I have a lot of discomfort traveling, it takes a lot out of me. I'm able to do so much more speaking and engaging with people where it would be really hard on me if I had to actually go in person. So I'm getting to bridge that geography and the limits of how many spoons I have to engage, and also getting to have some really amazing conversations. This year has been a great year for getting to connect with some really incredible people, present company included. So I'm grateful for that.
Maybe I'll ask the other two speakers before I wrap it up then. Jennifer, is that okay? Anne and Roberta?
Well, I've been finding a lot of joy in growing things, and I think seeing people get back to their gardens and really think about sustainability and food sovereignty in a different way throughout the pandemic. That's been a source of joy, and also gives me hope for how people might approach this whole system in a different way.
For me, I think I continue to find joy in a lot of conversations with ancestors, conversations with my kids, and being on the land and trying to create like one pot dishes because we're working and doing school online online school at the same time, and just appreciating the fact that we're able to have these conversations is also part of joy and hope for the next generations and our generations also. Thank you.
And I'll throw in so many of the things people have talked about. And just this past weekend, my mom and dad celebrated their 59th anniversary. I know, and they're both safe and healthy, for which I'm very grateful. Yeah, it made me very happy to go and be with them this past weekend. So, and this has been amazing. Thank you, everyone.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Shefali, do you want to say any final words? Otherwise, I'll start kind of wrapping things up.
No, I think I just want to thank everybody. And maybe I'll just add, I think the pandemic has been so interesting in that, as anyone who is working in disability will know, as Allison has mentioned, all of a sudden, all these things that had to be done in person, we can do them online. So woohoo! Hopefully we'll keep that going forward. Thank you very much, Jennifer. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Shefali, for moderating the conversation. And thanks to all of our talkers, lots to reflect on. And yeah, we're building a new world. We're in it, and we do it every single day. Now, if you enjoyed tonight's event, there's more. A week today, next Tuesday, October 26th, Facebook Canada has partnered with us to present the Walrus Talks at Home CanCon online. And this is about the new online creator economy. And then on Thursday, October 28th, we're partnering with Media Smarts to present the Walrus Talks at Home, Our Digital Lives. And this is exploring how the pandemic has really changed the way we engage with digital media, actually just building on what we were talking about. Check in with us at thewalrus.ca/events. You can see our schedule. You can register for events that you're interested in. Also, we take all the videos from our talks, including tonight, and we feature them in the Walrus Talks video room at our website. Also, keep an eye on your inbox. You're going to receive an email follow-up, and the best way to stay in touch with us is to opt in our newsletter so you won't miss a thing. At the Walrus, we believe that trustworthy journalism is an essential service, and with your support, we can continue to do what we do best. We have just launched our fall giving campaign. This is the time of year when we reach out to our community for support. So if you enjoyed this free event tonight and you wish to share your support, please consider making a donation at thewalrus.ca/donate. All gifts of $20 or more receive a charitable tax receipt. Thank you again to Farah Kurji and everyone at TD Bank Group for making this conversation possible, as well as our long-standing partnership together. Thank you as well to our annual sponsors. This is Air Canada, Facebook Canada, Inspire, Labatt Breweries of Canada, and Shaw. Community is so important in these COVID times, and each one of you is part of the Walrus. Thank you for joining us, and until soon, we'll meet again.